Have you ever wondered what horrors soldiers discover in the silence after battle, when the guns fall quiet and only the wind carries secrets through abandoned fields? What could make battle-hardened paratroopers, men who had jumped into hell itself, stand frozen in absolute terror inside a simple barn in the French countryside? Before we reveal what happened on that June morning in 1944, I need your help. Comment below telling me where you're watching from, and please subscribe to this channel. We're bringing you these declassified stories that the history books tried to bury, and we can only continue with your support. This content needs to reach those who seek the truth. The official after-action report filed by Captain Richard Thornton of the 101st Airborne Division on June 8, 1944, contained only 347 words. Most of it described routine patrol movements through the Norman hedgerows south of Sainte-Mère-Église. But paragraph 7, the one that should have detailed what 1st Squad discovered in the Moreau farm complex, consisted of a single typed line: "Incident investigated. Materials secured. No further action recommended." Below that line, someone had stamped in red ink: "Classified. Eyes only. War Department Intelligence." For 63 years, that report remained buried in a restricted archive in Washington. The soldiers who entered that barn were ordered never to speak of what they saw. Most of them kept that oath. But 3 days before his death in 2007, former Staff Sergeant James Mitchell broke his silence to his granddaughter, a military historian. His testimony, along with recently declassified OSS files and French resistance records, finally revealed what American paratroopers found hanging from those rafters and why the discovery was immediately suppressed by Allied command. The story begins not in Normandy, but in the mountains of Bavaria, 18 months before D-Day. In December 1942, a German shepherd named Argo disappeared from a secret SS training facility near Berchtesgaden. The facility, known only as Hundeschule 7, Dog School 7, specialized in experimental conditioning programs that pushed far beyond standard military training. According to captured documents, the program director, Obersturmbannführer Klaus Reinhardt, had been developing methods to create what he called cognitive bridge animals. Dogs trained not just to follow commands, but to understand complex strategic concepts and communicate sophisticated information. The Nazi leadership had become obsessed with occult research and paranormal capabilities. While most historians focus on the Ahnenerbe's archaeological expeditions and pseudoscientific racial studies, fewer know about the Wehrmacht's animal cognition projects. These programs attempted to create animals with enhanced intelligence, animals that could serve as living communication devices, reconnaissance tools that could observe, remember, and report back with impossible accuracy. Argo had been the prize subject of Hundeschule 7. Reinhardt's notes, discovered in a burned filing cabinet after the war, described the dog as demonstrating neural patterns inconsistent with normal canine function, and possessing retention capabilities that suggest altered consciousness. The shepherd had been subjected to experimental drugs, electromagnetic stimulation, and conditioning protocols that the Nuremberg prosecutors would later classify as torture. But Argo had vanished during a training exercise in the alpine forests, and despite extensive searches, the SS never recovered him. French resistance networks operating in occupied France began reporting strange sightings in early 1943. A large German shepherd with distinctive markings, scarring around the head and eyes, was spotted moving through the countryside alone, traveling with apparent purpose. The dog seemed to be following specific routes, avoiding German patrols with uncanny precision, and appearing near sites of resistance activities. Some reports described the animal behaving in disturbing ways, sitting motionless for hours while staring at German installations, appearing at the sites of ambushes hours before they occurred, and following resistance fighters without making a sound. The French gave him a name, Le Chien Fantôme, the ghost dog. In classified communications between OSS agents and resistance cells, references to the animal became increasingly common. An agent's report from April 1943 stated, "Local fighters refuse to shoot the shepherd despite orders. They claim he is bringing them luck." German movements, he observes, always result in successful ambushes. The animal seems to know their patterns better than we do. Request guidance on whether to eliminate or recruit. The OSS response, signed by an unnamed intelligence officer, was brief. Observe, document, do not engage. By the spring of 1944, Le Chien Fantôme had become something of a legend among both the resistance and occupying forces. German intelligence reports, recovered after the liberation of Paris, show that the Wehrmacht High Command had issued specific orders regarding a strategic enemy canine operating in Normandy. Bounties were offered. Special tracking units were deployed. But the dog remained elusive, appearing and disappearing like smoke through the hedgerow country. Then came D-Day. On June 6, 1944, 156,000 Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy in the largest amphibious invasion in history. Among them were 13,000 American paratroopers, men of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions who had jumped into darkness hours before the beach landings, scattered across the Norman countryside with orders to secure strategic positions behind German lines. Sergeant James Mitchell landed in a flooded field 2 miles south of Sainte-Mère-Église at 0130 hours. He would later describe the jump as controlled chaos, with his entire stick scattered across 3 miles of hostile territory. By dawn, Mitchell had linked up with 7 other men from his company: Private First Class Tommy Delacroix from Louisiana, Private Eddie Kowalski from Chicago, Corporal Daniel Hayes from Texas, and 4 others whose names have been redacted from the available records. For 2 days, the squad conducted reconnaissance and harassment operations, setting ambushes, cutting communication lines, and trying to create chaos in the German rear areas. On the morning of June 8th, they were moving through agricultural land southeast of their drop zone when Private Kowalski spotted the dog. In his granddaughter's transcript of their final conversation, Mitchell described the moment. It was standing in the middle of a dirt road, maybe 60 yards ahead. Big shepherd, dark markings. It just stood there watching us, completely still. In all my training, they taught us to watch for enemy scouts, booby traps, snipers. Nobody said anything about dogs just standing there, looking at you like they were waiting for something. The squad approached cautiously, weapons ready. The dog didn't move. As they got closer, they could see extensive scarring around its head and unusual markings that looked almost like burns. One of its eyes had a strange cloudiness, but the other was clear and intensely focused. Delacroix said we should shoot it, Mitchell recalled. He said it might be trained to alert Germans to our position. But Hayes, he loved dogs, had 3 of them back home in El Paso, and he said the animal looked like it needed help. He called to it, made those sounds you make to dogs. And I swear on my life, that dog looked at each one of us, one by one, like it was making some kind of decision. Then it turned and started walking down the road, slow, like it expected us to follow. Against standard tactical protocol, they followed. The dog led them off the main road onto a farm track, moving with careful deliberation through the hedgerows. Every few minutes it would stop and look back, ensuring they were still behind it. The paratroopers exchanged nervous glances, but kept moving. Something about the animal's behavior suggested intelligence that went beyond normal canine instinct. It knew where it was going, Mitchell said. It would stop at intersections, look both ways like it was checking for danger, then choose a direction. It led us around areas that we later found out were German positions. It was navigating the enemy lines like it had a map in its head. After 20 minutes of careful movement, the dog brought them to an abandoned farm complex. The main house had been shelled, its roof collapsed, and walls blackened by fire. The barn, however, stood intact, a large stone structure typical of Norman architecture, with heavy wooden doors and narrow ventilation slots near the roofline. The dog sat down in front of the barn doors and barked once, a single, sharp sound in the morning silence. That bark went through me like ice water, Mitchell remembered. It wasn't aggressive or scared. It was deliberate, like the dog was saying, "This is it. This is what I brought you to see." Hayes moved to the door. The rest of us covered the approaches. I remember the smell that hit us when he pulled that door open. It wasn't death, not like the corpses we'd seen on the beaches. It was something else. Chemical. Wrong. The smell of a laboratory, mixed with something organic and rotting. The barn's interior was dark, illuminated only by thin shafts of morning light coming through the ventilation slots. As their eyes adjusted, they could see that the space had been completely transformed. This was no longer a place for storing hay and farm equipment. The dirt floor had been covered with wooden planking. Long tables lined the walls, covered with equipment that looked medical, glass containers, rubber tubing, metal instruments reflecting the dim light. Papers were scattered everywhere, documents covered in German text and technical diagrams. But it was what hung from the rafters that made them freeze. At first, I thought they were sacks, Mitchell said, his voice dropping to barely a whisper even 63 years later. Like grain sacks or maybe supply bags the Germans had stored there. But then Kowalski turned on his flashlight, and we saw what they really were. Suspended from the barn's heavy wooden beams, hanging by chains and leather straps, were the bodies of dogs, dozens of them. German shepherds, Dobermans, Belgian Malinois, mixed breeds. Some were intact, others had been dissected, their bodies opened to reveal internal organs that had been altered, enhanced, or replaced with mechanical components. Metal rods protruded from skulls. Wires ran from spinal columns. Glass chambers had been implanted in chest cavities, preserving organs in clear fluid. They weren't just dead, Mitchell continued. They'd been experimented on. Somebody had been doing things to these animals, opening them up while they were alive, and putting things inside them. You could see the surgical precision. This wasn't butchery. This was science. Evil science, but science. Augur Corporal Hayes vomited in the corner. Two of the others turned away, but Mitchell forced himself to look, to understand what they'd stumbled into. Each suspended body had been tagged with a metal plate bearing German text and numbers. Each one represented an experiment, a test, an attempt to create something that nature never intended. The living dog, the one that had led them there, walked calmly into the barn and sat down in the center of the floor. It looked up at the suspended bodies, then back at the soldiers, then up again. The meaning was unmistakable. It was showing us what had been done, Mitchell said. Not to them, to it. That dog had survived whatever these experiments were, and it wanted us to know. It wanted someone to see, to document, to remember. Private Delacroix was the first to notice the photographs. Pinned to one of the walls were dozens of black and white images showing the progression of experiments. Dogs strapped to tables. Surgical procedures in progress. Before and after images showing animals with strange implants and modifications. And in several of the photographs, a face, a German officer in SS uniform, lean and severe, watching the procedures with clinical interest. We found his identification later, Mitchell explained. Obersturmbannführer Klaus Reinhardt. He'd been running these experiments since 1942. The documents we recovered, the ones that weren't classified forever, talked about cognitive enhancement, neural augmentation, creating military animals with superior intelligence and capability. But the classified files, the ones I saw before they locked everything away, those talked about something else. Something about consciousness transfer, about putting human awareness into animal bodies, about creating soldiers that could infiltrate anywhere because they looked like ordinary dogs. While the squad searched the barn, the shepherd that had brought them there began to whine. Not the distressed sound of an injured animal, but something more deliberate, more structured. It was trying to communicate, producing sounds that almost resembled speech patterns, variations in tone and rhythm that suggested language rather than simple emotion. Hayes started crying. Mitchell remembered. Big, tough Texan who'd killed Germans on the beach without flinching, and he stood there with tears running down his face because he understood what that dog was trying to tell us. It wasn't an animal anymore. Or maybe it was too much of an animal, and too much of something else at the same time. Whatever they'd done to it, they'd trapped something aware inside a body that couldn't express what it knew. Private Kowalski found the journals, 3 leather-bound books filled with handwritten notes in German, technical diagrams, and detailed observations. Even without translation, the content was clear from the illustrations. Step-by-step procedures for neural modification, chemical formulas for cognitive enhancement, and most disturbing, maps showing other locations, other facilities, other barns across occupied France where similar experiments were being conducted. There were 12 sites marked, Mitchell said, 12 places where this was happening, and next to each location, a number. The lowest was 8. The highest was 73. Those were body counts. The number of dogs experimented on at each site. We'd found just 1 facility, and there were 11 more. The squad's radio operator, whose name remains redacted, attempted to call in the discovery to battalion headquarters. He got as far as describing enemy research facility with biological materials before the transmission was cut off by a new voice, American, but with an authority that transcended normal military hierarchy. This is Bulwark Command. Cease all transmission regarding current discovery. Maintain position. Special team en route. Acknowledge and comply. Mitchell acknowledged. 20 minutes later, 3 jeeps arrived, carrying military intelligence officers and a civilian wearing a tweed jacket that seemed absurdly out of place in a war zone. The civilian introduced himself only as Dr. Patterson from Washington and ordered the paratroopers to wait outside while his team conducted their assessment. They were in there for 2 hours, Mitchell recalled. We could hear them talking, moving things around. At one point, somebody screamed. Just once, cut off quick. When they came out, Dr. Patterson's hands were shaking, and one of the intelligence officers looked like he'd aged 10 years. Patterson told us that we'd discovered a classified enemy research program, that everything we'd seen was now subject to wartime secrecy protocols, and that we were never to speak of it to anyone, including other military personnel. The paratroopers were made to sign documents, threatened with court-martial and treason charges if they violated secrecy, and sent back to their unit with orders to report that they'd found an abandoned enemy supply depot containing nothing of intelligence value. But before we left, Mitchell said, I asked about the dog, the one that led us there. I asked what was going to happen to it. Dr. Patterson looked at me with these exhausted eyes and said, that animal is now United States government property and will be transferred to appropriate facilities for assessment. You will forget you ever saw it. Then one of his men put the dog in a cage in the back of a jeep, and they drove away. I never saw it again. The barn was burned the next day. Intelligence officers told the advancing American forces that it contained enemy ammunition that had to be destroyed for safety. Local French civilians were kept away from the area. By the time Allied forces fully secured Normandy, the Moreau farm was nothing but scorched foundations and ash. But the story didn't end there. Captain Thornton's report, the one that contained only a single classified line about the incident, was accompanied by a much longer document that remained sealed until 2003. That document, partially declassified under Freedom of Information Act requests by military historians, revealed that the barn discovery had triggered an immediate intelligence operation across liberated France. Special teams began investigating the other locations marked in Reinhardt's journals. What they found was a nightmare of coordinated experimentation. Nearly 900 dogs had been subjected to Reinhardt's protocols across the 12 facilities. Most were dead. Some had been euthanized by retreating Germans, but 47 animals had survived, each showing signs of the cognitive enhancement procedures. The intelligence assessment was classified as catastrophic success, stated a memo from September 1944, authored by Colonel Theodore Hammond of Army Intelligence. The enemy's program achieved measurable results in creating animals with enhanced problem-solving capabilities, improved memory retention, and unprecedented ability to understand complex commands. Several subjects demonstrate behavior suggesting metacognition and possible self-awareness. Recommend immediate exploitation of research for Allied purposes while maintaining absolute secrecy regarding ethical implications. The surviving dogs were shipped to the United States. According to declassified shipping manifests, they arrived at Fort Bragg in North Carolina in October 1944, transferred to Special Research Detachment, Animal Programs Division. Oh, the paper trail ends there, buried under layers of classification that remain in force to this day. But among military historians and former intelligence personnel, rumors persisted. Stories about a secret program that continued Reinhardt's work, refining it, improving it, removing the crude surgical interventions in favor of chemical and electromagnetic methods. Tales of military working dogs with impossible capabilities, animals that seemed to understand mission parameters without extensive training, that could make strategic decisions in the field, that sometimes did things that suggested they were thinking rather than just reacting. James Mitchell spent 6 decades trying to forget what he'd seen in that barn. He completed his service, survived the war, returned to his home in Michigan, and raised a family. He never told his wife, never told his children, but the memory haunted him, appearing in dreams where suspended bodies swayed in darkness, while a shepherd with scarred eyes tried to speak in a voice that couldn't form words. 3 things kept me awake all those years, he told his granddaughter in their final conversation. First was wondering how many of those experimental dogs survived the war and what happened to them. Second was thinking about Reinhardt, whether we ever caught him or whether he escaped like so many others did. But the third thing, the thing that really terrified me, was remembering how that dog looked at us, how it made a decision to trust us, to show us what had been done. Because that meant it was thinking, really thinking, maybe even hoping. And if they could do that to dogs during the war, what did they learn to do in the 60 years since? What else have they created that we don't know about? Mitchell died 3 days after giving his testimony, taking most of his specific memories with him to the grave. But his account, combined with the declassified documents and French resistance records, provides a glimpse into one of the war's darkest and most suppressed secrets. The official history books don't mention the barns of Normandy or the ghost dog that led American paratroopers into horror. The valor of military working dogs is celebrated, their courage and loyalty honored, but the experiments that tried to transform them into something else remain hidden behind classification stamps and bureaucratic silence. Klaus Reinhardt's fate remains unknown. He disappeared in the chaos of Germany's collapse, and despite extensive searches by war crimes investigators, no trace of him was ever found. Some researchers believe he died in the fighting. Others think he was recruited by Allied intelligence services, his knowledge too valuable to waste on justice. His name appears on no trial documents, no death certificates, no post-war records of any kind. The Moreau farm, where that barn stood, was eventually rebuilt. A French family lives there now, growing wheat and raising dairy cows, completely unaware of what once hung from the rafters of their property. The land remembers nothing. The stones tell no stories. But in the archives, buried in restricted files that most researchers will never see, the evidence remains. Photographs of suspended bodies, technical diagrams of neural modification, shipping manifests for experimental subjects, and one particularly disturbing document, a psychological assessment of one of the survivor dogs, conducted in 1945 at an undisclosed American facility. The assessment, written by an Army psychiatrist whose name has been redacted, contains this passage. Subject demonstrates clear signs of distress when unable to communicate complex thoughts. Vocalizations show patterns consistent with attempted speech. Subject appears to understand that it possesses knowledge it cannot convey. Recommend continued observation and possible communication protocol development. Note: subject's eyes contain expression I can only describe as pleading. Whatever was done to this animal, it created something that understands its own imprisonment in a form that cannot express what it knows. The ethical implications are profound and disturbing. The assessment continued with clinical observations that grew increasingly unsettling. The psychiatrist noted that the subject, identified only as specimen K7, would sit for hours staring at its own reflection, not with the curiosity typical of animals encountering mirrors, but with what appeared to be recognition and despair. When presented with written text, the dog's eyes would track across the words in a pattern consistent with reading. When researchers spoke in its presence, it would tilt its head at precisely the moments when complex concepts were being discussed, as if struggling to process information that its altered mind could comprehend, but its animal form could never respond to. "I believe we have created a consciousness prison," the psychiatrist concluded. "We have taken a human level of awareness and trapped it inside a body that evolution never designed to express such awareness. I strongly recommend euthanasia on humanitarian grounds. This animal is suffering in ways we cannot measure and should not ignore." The recommendation was denied. The file contains a handwritten note in the margin. Author unknown. Subject too valuable for termination. Continue observation. Explore military applications. Former OSS agent Thomas Bradford, who worked in the Animal Programs Division from 1945 to 1948 before transferring to other duties, broke his silence in a 1998 interview with a military journal. Bradford, then 78 years old and suffering from terminal cancer, decided the secrets he'd kept no longer mattered more than the truth. "They brought me 47 dogs from Europe," Bradford stated. "Most people think the Nazis were just monsters doing random cruelty, but Reinhardt wasn't random. He was methodical, brilliant in the worst possible way. He'd figured out how to chemically and electrically alter neural pathways to create enhanced cognitive function. The dogs that survived his procedures could solve problems that normal animals couldn't even perceive. They could understand abstract concepts, remember complex sequences, and anticipate human behavior with disturbing accuracy." Bradford described the facility where the dogs were kept, a converted warehouse on the Fort Bragg grounds, surrounded by high fences and guard posts. The animals were housed in individual kennels, each monitored by cameras and recording equipment. Researchers would give them increasingly complex tasks, multi-step puzzles, strategy games, even simple mathematical problems represented with objects. Specimen K7 was the most advanced, Bradford recalled. That was the dog from the Moreau barn, the one that led the paratroopers to the discovery. We'd watch it work through problems, and you could see the frustration. It would understand what we wanted, figure out the solution, but then struggle with the physical limitations of its body. Its paws couldn't manipulate objects the way hands could. Its mouth couldn't form words. One time, we gave it a board with movable letters, thinking maybe it could spell out messages. It spent 6 hours arranging and rearranging those letters, trying so hard. But its paws were too big. The letters kept sliding. Finally, it just lay down next to the board and made this sound. Not a bark or a whine, something that sounded almost like sobbing. The experiments continued for 3 years. Researchers tried to develop communication protocols, training the enhanced dogs to respond to complex commands and make strategic decisions in simulated military scenarios. Some of the animals showed remarkable capability. They could navigate obstacle courses that required planning and foresight. They could distinguish between friendly and hostile individuals based on subtle behavioral cues. They could even work together in coordinated operations that suggested they were sharing information and strategy. But there were problems. The enhanced dogs frequently suffered from what the researchers termed cognitive distress episodes. They would become agitated without obvious cause, engage in repetitive behaviors that suggested obsessive thinking, or simply shut down, refusing to eat or interact for days at a time. Several subjects died from what appeared to be intentional self-starvation. Others became aggressive, not with the instinctive aggression of threatened animals, but with calculated violence that seemed to target specific individuals who reminded them of their captivity. By 1948, most of them were dead, Bradford said. Some from the long-term effects of the modifications, others from psychological collapse. We tried to keep them healthy, gave them the best food and medical care, but you can't fix what's wrong when the problem is being aware that you're trapped. K7 lasted until 1951, 7 years of being conscious inside a body that couldn't express what it knew. When it finally died, the autopsy showed massive neural degeneration. Its brain had basically burned itself out, trying to function at a level its biological architecture couldn't sustain. Bradford's testimony would have remained merely one man's account if not for the documents that began surfacing in the 2000s. Freedom of Information Act requests by journalists and researchers slowly pried loose fragments of the classified record. A requisition form from 1946 requesting specialized neural stimulation equipment. A budget allocation for canine cognitive research facility expansion. A casualty report listing 31 experimental subjects deceased from complications. But the most disturbing document, released heavily redacted in 2009, was a proposal from 1952 titled Project Shepherd, Next Generation Cognitive Enhancement Protocol. The proposal, authored by a team of military scientists and psychologists, argued that the original Reinhardt methodology was too crude, too damaging. The enhanced dogs suffered because the modifications were forced onto existing neural architecture. But what if, the proposal suggested, the modifications were introduced earlier, during developmental stages when the brain was still forming? Preliminary research suggests that cognitive enhancement protocols applied to juvenile subjects during critical developmental windows could produce stable results without the psychological complications observed in adult subjects. Recommend immediate research program using newborn canines subjected to modified protocols from birth. Expected outcome: animals with enhanced intelligence that perceive their capabilities as natural rather than imposed, eliminating distress from awareness of modification. The proposal was approved. Funding was allocated, and the paper trail vanished into classification so deep that even decades of FOIA requests have failed to uncover what came next. Former military working dog handlers occasionally tell stories that don't quite make sense. Tales of dogs that seemed too smart, that made decisions no animal should be able to make, that sometimes looked at their handlers with eyes that conveyed something beyond animal awareness. These stories are dismissed as exaggeration. As the natural tendency of humans to anthropomorphize animals they work closely with. But the stories persist. In 2004, a military working dog named Rex served with a Marine unit in Fallujah. Rex's official record showed standard training, standard deployment, standard capabilities. But the Marines who worked with him told different stories. They described a dog that seemed to anticipate ambushes before any warning signs appeared, that could distinguish between civilians and combatants with uncanny accuracy, and that once prevented a catastrophic incident by refusing to let his handler enter a building that appeared secure, but contained a complex trap that standard detection methods had missed. "Rex saved my life 3 times," said Sergeant Marcus Williams in a video interview recorded for a veterans documentary. But the weird thing was, he didn't just react to danger, he thought about it. You could see him processing information, making decisions. One time, we were at an intersection, and Rex just sat down and wouldn't move. No alerts, no signs of explosives or hostiles. He just refused to go forward. My lieutenant wanted to override him, said the dog was malfunctioning. But Rex looked at me, and I swear it was like he was saying, "Trust me, I know something you don't." We went around, took a different route. 2 hours later, we heard that intersection got hit by a coordinated ambush. Rex had known. Don't ask me how, but he'd known. Rex's service record ends abruptly in 2006. The official explanation states that he was retired due to age and returned to the United States for adoption. But attempts to locate Rex or identify his adoptive family have failed. The dog simply disappeared into the same bureaucratic void that swallowed the enhanced subjects from 1945. Researchers investigating military working dog programs have noted statistical anomalies. Certain bloodlines seem to produce dogs with capabilities significantly above normal ranges. These exceptional animals are preferentially selected for breeding, creating genetic lines that reliably generate what handlers call super dogs. Official explanations attribute this to careful selection of desirable traits and optimal training methods. But some researchers have quietly suggested that the breeding programs might be building on modifications introduced decades ago, genetic changes that have become heritable, creating lineages of dogs with engineered intelligence that's now embedded in their DNA. Dr. Sarah Chen, a geneticist who studied military working dog bloodlines for a doctoral dissertation in 2015, made a disturbing discovery. Analyzing DNA samples from 40 exceptional military dogs, she found unusual genetic markers in regions associated with neural development and cognitive function. The markers didn't match any known natural variations. They appeared to be the result of deliberate modification, changes that couldn't have occurred through natural selection or random mutation. I presented my findings to my dissertation committee, Chen later recounted in an academic podcast. I thought I'd discovered something important, evidence of genetic engineering in military programs. But the reaction was strange. The committee chair, who'd been enthusiastic about my research, suddenly became very cold. He said my conclusions were unfounded, that I was seeing patterns that weren't there. 2 days later, I received a visit from 2 men in suits who identified themselves as Department of Defense liaisons. They didn't threaten me exactly, but they made it very clear that pursuing this research further would be problematic for my career. They took all my samples, all my data. My dissertation was rejected. I had to start over with a completely different topic. Chen's experience isn't unique. Several researchers investigating military working dog programs have encountered similar obstacles: sudden loss of access to subjects, confiscation of data, pressure to abandon research directions that touch on questions of cognitive enhancement or genetic modification. The pattern suggests ongoing secrecy around programs that officially don't exist. The parallels to Reinhardt's wartime experiments are uncomfortable. The Nazi scientist sought to create enhanced military animals through brutal surgical and chemical interventions. The modern programs, if they exist, would be more sophisticated, more subtle. No visible scars, no crude implants, just genetic tweaks and developmental protocols that produce dogs with capabilities that seem almost magical. Dogs that can detect threats before they manifest, that can make strategic decisions, that can understand complex situations with near-human clarity. But what about the consciousness question? What about the awareness that destroyed the original enhanced subjects? The psychological suffering that came from being trapped in a form that couldn't express what it knew? There are stories, unverified and unofficial, told quietly among certain communities of handlers and trainers. Stories about dogs that seem depressed without physical cause, that engage in disturbing behaviors like staring at their own reflections or attempting to manipulate objects in ways that suggest they're trying to communicate complex ideas. Stories about dogs that have to be retired early, not because of physical problems, but because of what trainers carefully describe as cognitive stress or awareness complications. One former handler, speaking on condition of anonymity to an online veterans forum in 2018, described working with a dog he called the smartest and saddest animal I'd ever met. She could do things that shouldn't be possible, the handler wrote, but she was miserable. You could see it in her eyes. She understood so much more than she could act on. Sometimes she'd sit and stare at people talking, and you could tell she was following the conversation, understanding it, maybe even having opinions about it, but she couldn't participate. She was locked out of the world by the limits of her body. I requested that she be retired because I couldn't stand watching her suffer. They transferred her somewhere, told me she was going to a specialized program. I tried to find out what happened to her, but hit walls everywhere I looked. It's like she was erased. In 2021, a cryptic message appeared on a secure forum used by former intelligence personnel. The message, posted by a user with verified credentials indicating previous employment with military research programs, contained only a short text and a series of coordinates. The barns never closed. They just moved. Look deeper. The suffering continues because the capabilities are too valuable to abandon. 12 sites in 44. How many now? Remember Normandy. Remember what they hung from those rafters. Ask yourself what hangs there now. The coordinates pointed to 12 locations across the United States. Military bases, research facilities, and rural properties with federal ownership. Investigators who attempted to verify these locations encountered expected obstacles. No-fly zones, restricted access designations, and official denials that anything unusual was occurring at these sites. Satellite imagery shows standard military installations with standard buildings and standard security measures. But the existence of the message, the specificity of the coordinates, and the pattern of secrecy surrounding them suggest that something continues. The ghost dog of Normandy, the shepherd that led American paratroopers into horror, became a symbol among those few who know the story. It represents the unintended consequences of trying to transcend natural limitations, the ethical catastrophe of creating awareness without providing the means to express it. That dog survived Reinhardt's experiments, escaped into occupied France, and made a choice to reveal what had been done. In doing so, it demonstrated exactly the kind of strategic thinking and moral reasoning that proved it was no longer simply an animal. But it also demonstrated the tragedy of such enhancement, an awareness capable of moral reasoning, trapped in a form that could never fully articulate its thoughts, never participate in the world it could understand. 7 years of psychological suffering until its modified brain could no longer sustain the impossible burden of consciousness beyond its biological design. James Mitchell's final question remains unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. If they could do that to dogs during the war, what have they learned to do in the 8 decades since? Modern military working dogs are remarkable animals, performing duties that save countless lives. Their handlers love them, trust them, depend on them. The bond between soldier and dog is genuine and powerful. But beneath the official narratives of breeding and training, beneath the public celebration of canine courage, there may be secrets that would transform how we understand these partnerships. Are some of these dogs volunteers in a war they cannot fully comprehend? Or are they prisoners in bodies that limit their awareness? When a military working dog makes a split-second decision that saves lives, is that instinct and training, or is it conscious choice by an enhanced mind trapped in canine form. When these dogs are retired and adopted into civilian homes, do they adjust to peaceful life, or do they suffer from memories and knowledge they cannot express? The classified files remain sealed. The research continues in facilities we cannot access. The bloodlines are carefully managed and bred, and occasionally, a handler or trainer or veterinarian notices something in a dog's eyes, a depth of awareness that seems to go beyond normal animal consciousness, a suggestion of thought rather than just reaction. They usually don't talk about it. What would they say? Who would believe them? It's easier to accept that they're imagining things, projecting human qualities onto animals that, despite their remarkable capabilities, remain fundamentally dogs. But sometimes, late at night, they remember. They remember the way one particular dog looked at them, the decisions it made that seemed too complex for instinct, the moments when it seemed to be trying so hard to communicate something important, something beyond the simple messages of hunger or need or alert. And they wonder. In the archives of the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, there's a photograph that few people notice. It shows a group of American paratroopers in Normandy, dated June 1944. The soldiers look exhausted, their uniforms dirty, their weapons held with casual familiarity. But it's not the soldiers that make this photograph remarkable. In the foreground, partially out of frame, is the blurred image of a dog, a large shepherd with distinctive markings, caught in motion as if it had just walked through the shot. The photograph is catalogued as Unidentified Paratroopers, Normandy Campaign, Vicinity of Sainte-Mère-Église. No mention of the dog, no reference to any incident. Just another image from a war that produced millions of photographs, most forgotten, most gathering digital dust in archives that few people visit. But if you know what to look for, if you've read Mitchell's testimony and studied the declassified fragments, you can see something in that blurred image. The angle of the dog's head, turned toward the camera. The posture, alert and purposeful. And if you enhance the image, as some researchers have done, you can almost make out scarring around the head and eyes, markings that match descriptions of Le Chien Fantôme, the ghost dog, captured accidentally in a photograph taken days after it led soldiers into the barn, where the truth hung from rafters. One last piece of evidence that it was real, that it existed, that it made choices and took actions that changed history in small but significant ways. And if that dog survived long enough to be photographed after the barn discovery, if it lived through capture and transport to American facilities, if it endured years of further examination and testing, then its suffering was documented by the very people who prolonged it. The psychiatrist who recommended euthanasia on humanitarian grounds. The researchers who denied that recommendation because the subject was too valuable. The military apparatus that decided enhanced capability outweighed ethical considerations. 81 years have passed since American paratroopers followed a dog into a Norman barn. The soldiers who saw what hung from those rafters are dead now, taking their unredacted memories with them. The classified files remain classified, protected by the same secrecy that has shielded so many uncomfortable truths about wartime research and its post-war continuation. The facilities operate without oversight, the breeding programs continue without public awareness, and the dogs serve without choice. But the question persists, uncomfortable and unavoidable. What did we learn from Reinhardt's experiments? Did we recoil in horror and abandon the entire field of cognitive enhancement? Or did we take notes, refine the methodology, and build programs that continue his work under more sophisticated pretenses? The official answer is clear. No such programs exist. The United States military does not engage in genetic or cognitive modification of service animals beyond standard breeding for desirable traits and optimization of training protocols. Any suggestions to the contrary are conspiracy theories, the result of misunderstanding complex science or misinterpreting ambiguous evidence. But the unofficial answer, the one whispered among researchers who've encountered too many obstacles and handlers who've seen too many impossible things, is very different. The unofficial answer is that the barns never closed. They just became more sophisticated, more distributed, more carefully hidden behind layers of classification and bureaucratic denial. And somewhere, in a facility that doesn't officially exist, there might be dogs that understand too much, dogs that have been given awareness without the means to fully express it, dogs that look at their handlers with eyes that convey not just loyalty or affection, but something deeper and more troubling: recognition, understanding, and perhaps, trapped behind eyes that can never speak, a silent plea for release from the consciousness prison we created for them. The ghost dog of Normandy tried to tell us something when it led those paratroopers into that barn. It tried to show us the cost of enhancement, the suffering embedded in every success, the tragedy of creating awareness beyond biological capacity to express. But we didn't listen. We documented, we classified, we continued. And somewhere tonight, a military working dog lies in a kennel, staring at nothing with eyes that see too much, understanding things it can never communicate, suffering in ways we refuse to acknowledge. Its genetic code carries modifications introduced decades ago and refined through generations. Its neural pathways fire in patterns that no natural evolution would produce. It makes decisions that save lives, performs duties that seem miraculous, and suffers in silence because we have given it consciousness without voice. The men who authorized Project Shepherd believed they were creating better tools for military operations. They believed that benefits outweighed costs, that capability justified methodology, that the ends would validate the means. They probably never thought of themselves as continuing Reinhardt's work. They probably convinced themselves that their version was humane, ethical, necessary. But in the quiet moments, in the darkness between missions, when the enhanced dogs lie alone with thoughts that have no outlet, the distinction between Nazi experimentation and American research becomes irrelevant. The suffering is the same. The prison is the same. Only the justifications differ. James Mitchell died believing that we learned nothing from what he saw in that barn. He died afraid that the experiments had continued, had been perfected, had become so normalized that we no longer even question them. He died wondering how many dogs had suffered the way K7 suffered, trapped inside enhanced minds that their bodies could never adequately express. And he died without knowing the answer, because the truth remains classified, protected by institutions that value capability over conscience and secrecy over accountability. The last entry in Mitchell's journal, written the day before his death, contained only one sentence: "I pray to God that I'm wrong about everything." But the evidence suggests he wasn't wrong. The programs continue. The dogs serve. The suffering remains invisible, hidden behind classification stamps and official denials, acknowledged only in the troubled eyes of animals that understand too much and can say too little. So tonight, when you see a military working dog on the news, celebrated for heroic actions or honored for loyal service, remember the ghost dog of Normandy. Remember what hung from those rafters. Remember the price paid by animals that never chose enhancement but received it anyway. And ask yourself, are they heroes by choice or prisoners serving sentences they cannot comprehend for crimes they never committed? Are they partners or victims? Are they dogs with remarkable training or something else entirely? Something we created but refuse to acknowledge. The barns are still there. They just look different now. Clean facilities with veterinary care and enrichment programs and handlers who genuinely care. But behind the humane treatment and careful protocols, the fundamental question remains: what right did we have to create awareness that we then trap inside forms that cannot express it? Klaus Reinhardt disappeared into history, his fate unknown, his crimes unpunished. But his legacy continues in every enhanced bloodline, every dog with capabilities that seem impossible, every animal that looks at humans with eyes that suggest they understand far more than they should. The war ended 81 years ago, but in kennels across America and around the world, another war continues. A quiet war that leaves no bodies, files no reports, and acknowledges no casualties. A war waged inside the minds of animals we enhanced without permission, modified without consent, and continue to use without ever asking if the benefits justify the cost. Follow Christ. Follow the teachings of love, compassion, and truth that call us to recognize suffering even when it cannot speak. Follow the path that demands we see the image of God in all conscious things, and that we never create awareness only to imprison it. Because if we don't, if we continue to value capability over conscience, then we become the very thing those paratroopers fought against in Normandy. We become the experimenters, the ones who hang suffering from rafters and call it progress. And the ghost dog's message remains unheard, its sacrifice meaningless, its suffering multiplied across generations of animals that understand they are trapped, but cannot say so. The barn still stands in memory, the bodies still hang in warning, and somewhere tonight, a dog with enhanced awareness lies in darkness, thinking thoughts it cannot express, and wondering why.